They say your true character is revealed in how you treat those with no power over you. But for Eleanor Winters, head librarian at Westfield Public Library, it was how she treated a quiet 10-year-old boy because of his father's red MAGA hat that ultimately sealed her fate. She didn't know it then, standing behind her polished wooden desk, but her carefully constructed 15-year career was about to crumble between her perfectly manicured fingers. The library had fallen silent that afternoon. Not the peaceful silence of concentration, but the heavy quiet that follows a public confrontation. Staff members avoided eye contact, pretending to busy themselves with reshelving books or typing furiously at their computers. Parents ushered their children away, whispering explanations in hushed tones. And in the center of it all stood Eleanor, chin raised, utterly convinced she'd done the right thing. But the look on the little boy's face as he clutched his science project notes to his chest and walked away, that would haunt her later. Tears welling in his eyes that he refused to let fall, his small shoulders squared with the kind of dignity that children shouldn't have to summon. Eleanor had made her point. She had taken her stand. And now, let me show you exactly how it all came crashing down. 3 hours earlier, the afternoon had begun like any other Tuesday at Westfield Public Library. Eleanor Winters moved through the stacks with practiced efficiency, her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floors. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew every book, policy, and procedure by heart. This wasn't just her workplace, it was her domain. The library had been Eleanor's sanctuary since she'd taken over as head librarian 12 years ago. Under her leadership, it had transformed from a dusty, outdated collection to a modern community hub with expanded digital archives, weekly reading programs, and a reputation for excellence that stretched across 3 counties. Eleanor took immense pride in this transformation. Perhaps too much. "Miss Winters, could you approve this community event proposal?" Sarah, one of the younger librarians, approached with a folder in hand. Eleanor took it without breaking stride, her critical eye already scanning the contents. "Leave it with me. I'll review it after I finish my rounds," she replied, tucking the folder under her arm as she continued her inspection of the premises. Eleanor's perfectionism was legendary among the staff. Nothing escaped her attention. A book shelved in the wrong section, a computer left on standby, a chair pushed out from a table. The library operated according to her exacting standards, and while some found her demanding, none could deny the results. Westfield had become a model institution under her watch. At precisely 3:45 p.m., the after-school rush began. The quiet atmosphere shifted as students filtered in, some heading straight for the computers, others gathering at study tables. Eleanor observed them from her elevated desk position, a small smile pulling at her lips. This was what she worked for. Young minds seeking knowledge under her careful supervision. Among them was 10-year-old Max Parker, a slight boy with glasses too big for his face and a battered notebook clutched in his hands. He moved hesitantly through the library, stopping occasionally to check the section markers. His uncertainty was palpable, the nervous energy of a child in unfamiliar territory. Eleanor watched him, already making mental notes about proper library etiquette she might need to enforce. Max approached the reference desk where Lily, one of the assistant librarians, was helping another patron. He waited patiently, shifting from one foot to another, his eyes darting around the library with barely contained excitement. When Lily finally turned to him, his words tumbled out in a rush about a science project on renewable energy and research materials he couldn't find online. "Of course I can help you with that," Lily said warmly, coming around the desk. "We have an excellent section on environmental science. Let me show you where to start." Eleanor nodded approvingly from her position. This was exactly how things should operate: efficient, helpful, maintaining the library's standards while nurturing young minds. But her approval was short-lived. The library doors swung open and a man walked in, his pace unhurried but purposeful. He was in his early 40s, casually dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt. Nothing about him would have caught Eleanor's attention except for one detail: the bright red MAGA hat perched atop his head, its message visible from across the room. Eleanor's posture stiffened immediately, her lips pressing into a thin line. The man scanned the room, spotted Max with Lily by the reference section, and raised a hand in greeting. "Dad, Max called out, his face lighting up. "I found where the books are." The man smiled and gave a thumbs up before settling into a chair near the entrance, pulling out his phone while his son continued his research. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the hat, her disapproval radiating like a physical force. "Sarah," Eleanor said quietly, beckoning the young librarian closer. "Who is that man?" Sarah glanced over, then back to Eleanor with a shrug. "I think he's new in town. That's his son Max. Sweet kid, comes in for story time sometimes." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And he thinks it's appropriate to wear political statements in a public library? A place of learning and neutrality?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I don't think he's causing any disruption. He's just waiting for his son." But Eleanor was already rising from her seat, smoothing down her blouse with deliberate movements. "It's not about disruption, Sarah. It's about principles. This is a nonpartisan public space. We have policies about this sort of thing." The irony of Eleanor's statement, claiming neutrality while reacting so strongly to a political symbol, was lost on her as she made her way across the library floor. Her steps were measured, her expression set in what the staff had come to call her policy enforcement face. Several patrons glanced up as she passed, sensing the tension in her rigid posture. "Excuse me, sir," Eleanor said, her voice pitched low but firm as she approached Max's father. He looked up from his phone, eyebrows raised in question. "I need to inform you that we have a policy against political messaging in the library. Your hat constitutes such messaging. I must ask you to remove it or step outside while your son conducts his research." The man blinked, clearly taken aback by the direct confrontation. Around them, a few nearby patrons paused what they were doing, attention caught by the exchange. "It's just a hat," he said calmly, looking genuinely confused. "I'm not campaigning or disturbing anyone. I'm just waiting for my boy to finish his project research." Eleanor's spine straightened even more, if that were possible. "Nevertheless, sir, the policy exists to maintain our neutral environment. The hat makes a political statement that could make other patrons uncomfortable." Her tone left no room for debate, each word precisely chosen and delivered with administrative authority. This wasn't a discussion, it was a directive. "Dad, I found some really cool books on wind turbines." Max's excited voice cut through the tension as he rounded the corner, arms full of books, completely oblivious to the confrontation unfolding. His father's expression softened immediately as he turned toward his son, the argument momentarily forgotten in the face of the boy's enthusiasm. "That's great, buddy," he said, his voice warm with genuine interest. "Why don't you show me what you've got there?" Max began laying the books out on a nearby table, eagerly flipping pages to show his father particular diagrams. Eleanor stood rigidly beside them, her presence an uncomfortable intrusion on the father-son moment. The contrast between their warmth and her coldness was stark. "Sir," Eleanor persisted, her voice taking on an edge now that she was being ignored. "I need you to address the hat situation." The man looked up from the book his son was showing him, his expression shifting from warmth to something more guarded. "Max, why don't you keep looking for what you need? I need to talk with the librarian for a minute." Max's eyes darted between his father and Eleanor, the joy in them dimming as he sensed the tension. "Is everything okay, Dad?" The concern in his young voice was palpable. The man squeezed his son's shoulder reassuringly. "Everything's fine, bud. Just a misunderstanding. Go on now." Max nodded reluctantly and headed back toward the stacks, glancing over his shoulder as he went. Once Max was out of earshot, the man stood, keeping his voice low. "Look, I understand you have policies, but I'm not causing any disturbance. I'm helping my son with a school project. The hat isn't hurting anyone." His tone was reasonable, without the confrontational edge Eleanor had expected, which somehow irritated her even more. In her mind, reasonable people didn't wear such hats in the first place. "Our policies exist for a reason," Eleanor insisted, crossing her arms. "This is a space where everyone should feel welcome, regardless of political affiliation. That hat represents divisive politics." She gestured toward it with a slight tilt of her head, her disdain evident in the gesture. "I must insist you remove it while inside our facility." The father took a deep breath, clearly working to maintain his composure. "My son has a science project due tomorrow. We've driven 30 minutes to use your resources because our local library is under renovation. I'm not here to make a political statement. I'm here to support my son's education." His calm reasoning only reinforced Eleanor's conviction that she was in the right. "Then I suggest you support it without the hat," she replied crisply. "You can remove it, wait in your car, or take your son elsewhere. Those are your options." Around them, the library had grown quieter. Other patrons pretending not to listen while catching every word. Several staff members exchanged worried glances, but none intervened. Eleanor's authority was absolute in these walls. The man looked at Eleanor for a long moment, searching her face as if trying to understand the depth of her resolve. Then, without another word, he walked over to where Max was paging through a book on solar energy. "Hey buddy," he said gently, kneeling beside him. "We need to pack up. We'll find another way to get your research done." Max's confusion was immediate and heartbreaking. "But Dad, I just found the perfect books. My project is due tomorrow." His voice trembled slightly as he clutched the book closer. "I know, Max. I'm sorry. We'll figure something out, I promise. Maybe we can find what you need online." The man began helping his son gather his notebooks, his movements deliberate, his back rigid with suppressed emotion. Eleanor watched the scene unfold, a flicker of doubt finally breaking through her certainty. The boy's disappointment was palpable, his small face crumpling despite obvious efforts to be brave. This wasn't what libraries were supposed to do. They weren't supposed to turn away eager young minds. Yet here she was, standing firm on principle while a child's educational needs went unmet. Lily approached hesitantly from the reference desk. "Miss Winters," she murmured, "maybe we could make an exception just this once? The boy really needs those materials, and they're not disturbing anyone." Eleanor turned her cool gaze on her subordinate. "Exceptions undermine policy, Lily. You know that. If we allow it once, where do we draw the line next time?" "Dad, please," Max was saying, his voice rising with distress. "Can't you just take off your hat? It's really important. I worked so hard on this already." The pain in the boy's voice cut through the library's hush. The father knelt again, putting both hands on his son's shoulders, his voice too low for others to hear. Whatever he said made Max's eyes fill with tears. "I'll wait in the car then," the man finally said, straightening up. "Max can stay and finish his research. Will that satisfy your policy, miss?" He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. "Winters. Eleanor Winters, head librarian. And yes, that would be acceptable." She managed to make even this concession sound like a victory. The father nodded curtly, squeezed his son's shoulder once more, and turned to leave. Max watched him go, then turned back to the books on the table, his earlier enthusiasm completely evaporated. He sat alone, a small figure hunched over large textbooks, occasionally wiping at his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Eleanor returned to her desk, telling herself she'd done what was necessary to uphold the library's values. But the victory felt hollow as she watched Max struggle alone with his research. Twice he approached Lily for help, his questions clearly requiring guidance that a 10-year-old couldn't navigate alone. The third time, when he needed access to the library's digital archives for recent studies, he approached Eleanor's desk directly, his notebook clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Excuse me, Miss Winters," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need help finding some statistics for my project. The other librarian said I need special permission to access the state energy database." His glasses had slipped down his nose, and he pushed them up with a nervous gesture. Eleanor looked down at him, acutely aware of the watching staff. For a moment, something softened in her. This was what libraries were for, helping curious minds find answers. She began to rise from her chair, but then remembered the confrontation with the boy's father, the stubborn refusal to respect the principles she stood for. Her expression cooled again. "I'm quite busy at the moment. You'll have to wait for Miss Carter to be available again." The rejection was subtle, but unmistakable. Max stood there for a moment longer, then nodded and turned away, his small shoulders slumping further. Eleanor watched him go, ignoring the pit forming in her stomach. She'd made her point. Policy was policy. Personal feelings couldn't interfere with professional standards. At least, that's what she told herself as she returned to her administrative tasks. An hour passed, and soon the library would be closing. Max had worked diligently at his table, taking notes and flipping through books, but the difficulty of the task without proper guidance was evident. Twice more he'd approached Lily, who helped when she could between other patrons. Eleanor deliberately busied herself with cataloging work, avoiding both the boy and the judgmental glances from her staff. Finally, with 15 minutes until closing, Max gathered his materials and approached the checkout desk. "I'd like to borrow these, please," he said to Sarah, placing 3 books on renewable energy on the counter. His notebook was filled with careful handwriting, but his expression remained downcast. The excitement that had animated him earlier was completely gone. "Of course," Sarah replied with a gentle smile. "Do you have your library card with you?" Max reached into his pocket, then froze, his face falling further. I forgot it. It's in my dad's wallet. He's waiting in the car." He looked up anxiously. "Can I still check them out?" "Just until tomorrow? My project is due and I really need them." Sarah glanced toward Eleanor, who was pretending not to listen while catching every word. "I'm sorry, Max," Sarah said quietly. "We need a card for checkout. It's policy." The last 2 words carried a weight of regret, an echo of the earlier confrontation. Max's eyes welled up again, but he nodded with the resignation of someone too young to be experiencing such disappointment. "I understand," he whispered, carefully returning the books to the return cart. "Thank you for trying to help me." He gathered his notebook and pencil case, his movements slow and deliberate, as if prolonging the inevitable moment when he'd have to tell his father he had failed. The sight struck something in Eleanor. A realization that she had caused this, that her principal had come at the cost of a child's education. "Wait," she found herself saying, surprising even herself. Max turned, hope flickering briefly across his face. Eleanor hesitated, torn between strict adherence to policy and the fundamental purpose of her institution. The moment stretched between them, weighted with possibility. Then she straightened, professionalism reasserting itself. "Remember to bring your card next time." The hope in Max's eyes died. He nodded silently and headed toward the exit, empty-handed, save for his notebook filled with incomplete research. Eleanor watched him go, telling herself she'd done what she had to do. Rules existed for a reason. Exceptions led to chaos. These were the principles that had guided her career. Yet they'd never before left such a bitter taste in her mouth. The door closed behind Max, and Eleanor was surprised to find her hands trembling slightly. She clasped them together tightly, forcing composure as she addressed her staff. "Please begin closing procedures." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the uneasiness she felt. Around her, the library staff moved with unusual quietness, the tension still lingering in the air. Outside, through the large front windows, Eleanor could see Max climbing into a silver SUV where his father waited. She couldn't see their faces, couldn't hear their conversation, but the boy's slumped posture told its own story. The car remained parked for several minutes, the father presumably consoling his son. Then, unexpectedly, instead of driving away, the father got out of the car. Eleanor watched with growing apprehension as he walked back toward the library entrance, his red hat still firmly in place. He entered just as they were preparing to lock up, his expression composed but determined. "I'd like to speak with whoever's in charge here," he said to Sarah, who was nearest the door. "The head librarian, please." "That would be me," Eleanor said, stepping forward, squaring her shoulders. She expected anger, perhaps even raised voices. What she didn't expect was the calm, almost sympathetic look he gave her. "Miss Winters, I'm Daniel Parker," he said, extending his hand. Eleanor hesitated before shaking it briefly, her confusion evident. "I believe we got off on the wrong foot earlier." "Mr. Parker, we're closing for the evening," Eleanor replied stiffly. "If you have a complaint, our website has a feedback form that goes directly to our board of trustees." She began gathering her belongings, a clear dismissal. Daniel Parker didn't move. Instead, he smiled slightly, a gesture that contained no warmth whatsoever. "The board of trustees," he repeated, nodding slowly. "Yes, I'm quite familiar with them. In fact, I had lunch with Chairwoman Stevenson just last week." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you refused to help my son with his education today because of my hat." "A hat, Miss Winters, not a disruption." not a violation of any actual library policy. Eleanor froze, her practiced composure slipping for the first time. "We have guidelines about political messaging in public spaces," she began, but Daniel cut her off with a raised hand. "I've read the library's bylaws and policies cover to cover, Miss Winters. There is no such official policy. What you enforced today was your personal preference, not library regulation." The staff still present had stopped pretending not to listen. Lily and Sarah exchanged glances, while Tom from the IT department lingered near the reference desk, ostensibly shutting down computers. Eleanor felt the weight of their attention, the silent judgment. "Mr. Parker, I assure you, our practices are designed to maintain a neutral, welcoming environment for all patrons." "Neutral?" Daniel repeated, his eyebrows rising. "There was nothing neutral about your treatment of my son. He came here eager to learn and left in tears. He's 10 years old, Miss Winters. 10. And because you objected to my hat, which, by the way, I only wear because it was a gift from my late father, you decided his education was less important than your personal politics." The mention of his father's gift caught Eleanor off guard, complicating what had seemed a clear moral stance. She swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of her footing in this conversation. "I apologize if your son was upset, but—" Daniel shook his head, cutting her off again. "No, don't apologize if he was upset. He was upset. That's a fact, not a possibility." Eleanor drew herself up straighter, grasping for her usual authority. "Mr. Parker, while I regret any distress, I was simply following established—" But Daniel wasn't finished. "You know what my son told me in the car just now?" he asked, his voice softer, but somehow more intense. "He said maybe he shouldn't do his science project on renewable energy. Maybe he should pick something less controversial." The words hung in the air between them, their weight almost tangible. "He's 10 years old," Daniel repeated, "and already he's learning that pursuing knowledge can make him a target. That curiosity has political consequences. Is that really the lesson you want to be teaching in your library, Miss Winters?" For once, Eleanor had no ready response. The practiced phrases about policy and standards felt hollow in the face of this simple truth. She looked past Daniel, to where Max waited in the car, his small figure just visible through the windshield, hunched over what was probably his notebook. The sight made her stomach twist with something uncomfortably like shame. "I think we're done here," Daniel said after the silence had stretched too long. "But know this, tomorrow morning I have a meeting with the Library Board of Trustees. Not as a concerned parent, though I certainly am that." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, placing it deliberately on the counter between them. "But as the owner of the Parker Foundation, which funds this library." Eleanor's blood ran cold as she stared at the card. The Parker Foundation. Even she, isolated in her administrative bubble, knew what that meant. The foundation had donated the land the library stood on 20 years ago. They had funded the digital archive expansion, the children's wing, the community meeting spaces. Without the Parker Foundation, Westfield Public Library would be a fraction of what it was. She began, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded once, his expression unchanged. "Yes, Miss Winters. The library you've been running with such rigid principles exists because my family believed everyone deserves access to knowledge. Everyone, regardless of what hat they might be wearing." The irony settled over the room like a weight, pressing the air from Eleanor's lungs. Daniel turned to go, then paused at the door. "My son still needs to finish his project. It's on renewable energy sources and their potential to transform rural communities." He looked back at Eleanor, his eyes tired now rather than angry. That's what was so important today. Not politics, not hats, just a boy trying to learn something that might actually make a difference someday. With that, he walked out, leaving Eleanor standing motionless among her silent staff. Through the window, she watched him return to the car, say something to Max, and drive away. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the empty spaces, the darkness settling over the library grounds like a final curtain. Eleanor stood there long after they'd gone, the business card still on the counter, accusing in its simplicity. "Miss Winters?" Lily's voice finally broke the silence. "Should we finish closing up?" Eleanor nodded mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She picked up Daniel Parker's card, turning it over in her fingers. The Parker Foundation. How had she not made the connection? The family was known throughout the county, their philanthropy legendary, yet she'd seen only a hat, not the man or the child who needed help. That night, Eleanor barely slept. She sat at her kitchen table until the early hours, nursing a cup of tea gone cold, replaying the day's events. Had she really denied a child access to knowledge because of her own political bias? Had she truly prioritized her distaste for a symbol over her duty as a librarian? The questions circled like accusers, allowing no peace, no comfortable justification. Morning arrived with a sense of inevitability. Eleanor dressed with particular care, as if proper appearance could somehow armor her against what was to come. She arrived at the library earlier than usual, before any other staff. The building stood quiet and dignified in the morning light, unaware that its leadership hung in the balance. By 9 o'clock, the Board of Trustees had assembled in the meeting room. Eleanor sat outside, straight-backed and pale, waiting to be called in. Through the door's window, she could see Daniel Parker at the table, his infamous hat nowhere in sight today. Instead, he wore a tailored suit that marked him as the businessman and philanthropist he was, not the easy target she had mistaken him for. "Miss Winters, we're ready for you now," the board secretary announced, holding the door open. Eleanor rose and entered the room with as much dignity as she could muster. 7 faces turned toward her, 6 board members and Daniel Parker. Chairwoman Stevenson gestured to an empty chair. "Please, have a seat. We've been discussing yesterday's incident." Eleanor sat, folding her hands in her lap to hide their slight tremor. "I understand my actions have caused concern," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I believed I was upholding the library's values of neutrality and inclusivity." Even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow now, stripped of the righteousness that had fueled them yesterday. "Miss Winters," Chairwoman Stevenson said, her tone gentle but firm, "we've reviewed Mr. Parker's account of yesterday's events. We've also spoken with several staff members who were present." She glanced down at her notes. "While we appreciate your 15 years of service and the many improvements you've brought to our institution, we are deeply troubled by what occurred." Eleanor nodded, accepting the rebuke. "I understand. I made a judgment call that I now recognize was flawed." The admission cost her dearly, each word like a stone dropped from a height she'd built over years of professional certainty. "I allowed personal feelings to override professional responsibility. It won't happen again." Daniel Parker leaned forward slightly. "The issue isn't just about yesterday, Miss Winters. My son was one child on one day. The real question is how many others have been affected by this approach. How many people have felt unwelcome in this library because they didn't align with your personal views of who deserves help and who doesn't?" The question struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She had never considered herself unwelcoming. Strict, yes. Demanding of proper behavior, certainly, but unwelcoming. Yet looking back with newly opened eyes, she could see moments where her principles might have created barriers. The homeless man she'd asked to leave because his appearance was disruptive. The teenager with the provocative t-shirt she'd insisted turn it inside out. "I've always believed I was serving the library's best interests," she said finally, her voice smaller than she'd ever allowed it to be in a professional setting. "I thought standards and policies protected our institution. I never considered that they might be keeping people from knowledge they need and deserve." The admission felt like standing naked before the board, all her professional armor stripped away. Chairwoman Stevenson nodded slowly. "That's what concerns us most, Eleanor. A library's fundamental purpose is to connect people with information, all people, regardless of who they are or what they believe. When we start deciding who deserves that connection based on anything other than behavior that actively disrupts others' access, we've failed our mission." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of formal language and careful statements. The board had decided not to terminate Eleanor's employment, a mercy she hadn't expected, but she would be stepping down as head librarian. A position as research coordinator would be created for her, utilizing her organizational skills without putting her in direct authority over patron services. As the meeting concluded, Daniel Parker approached her in the hallway. "Miss Winters," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who forgot the true purpose of the work you do. We all lose sight sometimes of what really matters." He held out his hand, an offer of, if not forgiveness, then at least resolution. Eleanor took it, her grip firm despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Your son," she said, struggling to meet his eyes. "Did he finish his project?" It seemed such a small thing now, yet suddenly it was the only thing that mattered. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "He did. We found another way. He's presenting it to his class today, actually." "I'm glad," Eleanor said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "He seemed very bright, very curious." Daniel nodded, a father's pride momentarily overtaking everything else. "He is. He wants to design wind turbines someday that can work in areas with minimal space requirements." He paused, then added, "If you'd like, I could have him bring his project by sometime. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. Isn't that what libraries are about?" As Eleanor watched Daniel Parker walk away, something shifted inside her, a crumbling of certainty, yes, but also perhaps the first fragile foundation of something better. In her 15 years at Westfield Library, she had categorized and organized, regulated and standardized. She had created a perfect system. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that systems exist to serve people, not the other way around. 3 months later, Eleanor sat at her new desk in the research department, helping a college student navigate digital archives for a thesis project. The work was different, but satisfying in ways her administrative role had never been. She was connecting people directly with knowledge again, remembering why she'd become a librarian in the first place. Across the library, Lily, now the head librarian, was helping a young boy find books on marine biology. The boy's father stood nearby, wearing a t-shirt with a political slogan Eleanor disagreed with. She noticed it, then deliberately turned her attention back to her student. The father's shirt didn't matter. The boy's curiosity did. It had taken losing everything she thought important to remember that simple truth. The door opened and Max Parker entered, clutching a science fair ribbon and a rolled-up poster. He spotted Eleanor and waved, his smile wide and unguarded. "Miss Winters, Dad said I could show you my project. I got first place." The excitement in his voice was infectious, unmarred by the memory of their previous encounter. Children, Eleanor was learning, forgave more easily than adults. "I'd love to see it, Max," she replied, meaning every word. As he unrolled his poster on a nearby table, explaining each diagram with enthusiasm, Eleanor caught sight of Daniel Parker watching from near the entrance. He nodded once in acknowledgement, neither friendly nor hostile, a simple recognition of the new reality they had constructed from the ruins of the old. Eleanor returned the nod before turning her full attention back to Max's explanation of vertical axis wind turbines. This, she realized, was what libraries were truly meant to be. Not fortresses of regulation or battlegrounds for adult ideologies, but bridges between curiosity and knowledge, unobstructed by anything as insignificant as the hat someone wore. Later that afternoon, as she shelved books in the reference section, a task she'd once considered beneath her position, but now found oddly satisfying, Eleanor overheard a new librarian politely but firmly correcting a patron who was being disruptive. The interaction was handled with respect and clarity, focusing on behavior that affected others, not on who the person was or what they represented. Eleanor found herself smiling slightly. Maybe something good had come from her mistake after all. Maybe the library was better now, more truly open to everyone. Her pride had cost her a position, but perhaps it had bought something more valuable for the institution she still loved despite everything. A clearer vision of its purpose, unfiltered by bias or judgment. The light through the high windows was beginning to fade when Eleanor gathered her things to leave for the day. As she passed the children's section, she noticed Max's renewable energy project displayed prominently near the science books. Lily had added a small sign, "Local Student Innovation, inspired by research at your library." The sign made Eleanor pause, a lump forming unexpectedly in her throat. That project had almost never happened, that curiosity almost extinguished, all because she had seen a hat instead of a child. The realization still stung months later. But the display wasn't a reminder of her failure. It was evidence that the system could heal, could learn, could become better than the sum of its human errors. Outside, the evening was settling over the town, lights beginning to glow in windows. Eleanor took a deep breath of the cool air, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. Tomorrow would bring new patrons, new questions, new opportunities to remember what truly mattered in her profession. Not control, not authority, not even principles, if those principles stood between a curious mind and the knowledge it sought. Just the simple, radical act of helping someone find what they needed, no matter who they were or what hat they wore. What do you think? How would you have handled this situation if it were you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced anything similar in your own life? Don't forget to like and share if this story resonated with you.